Given today is the closest release we'll get to April 1st in 2025, today by popular vote, I want to explore a hypothetical. We've discussed in past episodes how interconnected the NATO defence ecosystem is and how reliant some European states have become on American weapons. But apparently for today's more lighthearted episode, more than half of you wanted me to consider a world where access to those American systems was cut. The task of finding cost-effective European alternatives for European militaries has always been held back by some very entrenched political realities. States often have strong incentives to go their own way on equipment, leading to European militaries leaning on a huge array of designs, many of which are produced in small numbers without the advantages of economies of scale. With one of the core challenges here being that there is no European military or unified procurement strategy, just dozens of national and multilateral programs. But what if there weren't? What if we just click our fingers and assume that a pan-European defence force is now a thing, and our task is to pick its gear, consolidating equipment choices down until they can be purchased on the kind of scale more associated with the US or People's Republic of China? We'll throw in a few additional curveballs, of course, but while this is mostly meant as a more lighthearted episode, it also starts to explore, I think, a serious question. If you removed political and fragmentation factors, does Europe have the designs and capacity it needs to equip a world standard military? And where there are glaring gaps without US supplies, where are they? To do that, we'll start with the basic brief of what we're trying to do and a couple of rules to make it more challenging. Then we'll work through a very abbreviated version of your usual strategy to procurement process. We'll establish what we want our European Defence Force, the EDF, to be able to do, and then go about picking equipment to enable it to do it. We'll mostly go through service by service, covering a good sample of equipment categories, but by no means all of them. Try and ask some key questions as we go. Namely, how does the EDF's equipment end up looking different to that of the United States? And where there are or aren't serious capability gaps without access to that American kit. So let's establish some ground rules and your basic brief. Congratulations, Commissioner, the European Defence Force is now a thing, but how it happened or how it's structured is mostly irrelevant to you, because your only task now is to equip the thing in a way that furthers European strategic autonomy. Budget isn't necessarily an issue, but who you buy from is. You're not allowed to draw on American systems or systems that aren't substantially manufactured in Europe, and no matter what weird choices it leads to, every involved country has to get at least a contract for something. You can't just give all the contracts to the French, for example, and head to the pub by lunch. You have to take full advantage of the various industrial capabilities across Europe. In terms of who's in scope, we're going to assume it means all European Union members, plus non-US NATO allies that look like they might be trying to get into the European rearmament scheme. So Canada, the United Kingdom and Norway are all in, which means yes, I'm going to have to try and find a defence product I want to buy from Canada that somehow doesn't include American components. Unfortunately for the moment, Turkey is out, even though it being in would solve a number of our problems. Now in prepping for this challenge, I gave a lot of consideration to just how tight we want to make the rules. Because if you're willing to ban absolutely any nexus with a foreign company, things can get pretty silly pretty quickly. Let's just say that Sergeant Snuffy is driving along in his American-built M1 Abrams main battle tank, getting ready to engage some targets, when suddenly the main gun disappears, because that's a licensed-built Rheinmetall RH-120. He goes for the Coax machine gun, but that also blips out of existence, because the US-built M240 is basically the American version of the Belgian FN Mag. Presumably thinking screw this for a bad joke and not wanting to resort to ramming attacks just yet, he gets on his American-built radio and calls for air support instead. The nearby F-35s, however, are having problems. Suddenly missing components from that aircraft's very international supply chain, they're now struggling with certain things like flying. The pilots, however, are presumably very focused on troubleshooting those issues regardless, because the US-16E ejection seat of the F-35 is a Martin Baker product. Corporate headquarters, Uxbridge, United Kingdom. That leaves our NCO on the ground, considering his vastly diminished array of offensive options. The AT-4 they had stashed is gone, because that's Swedish. The nearby screening infantry, who'd only just had new service rifles issued, now have them dramatically unissued, because if we're ruling out any foreign connection, that includes foreign ownership. Sig-Sauer Incorporated is an American firm, but it's owned by L&O Holding, so the new XM7 rifle is out. Switching to your pistol might be faster than reloading, but not if the pistol in question is also a SIG. The previous service pistol, the M9, was a Beretta, so also gets blipped, and so unless there's an ancient warrant officer around with a 1911, pistols are out as well. That even further reduces our poor Sergeant Snuffy's immediate offensive options down to basically 2. Gunning that 1500 horsepower engine and driving the vehicle with the kind of aggression you normally only see at a 3:30 PM school pickup, or falling back on the Mardu's 50 cal, an American design dating back more than a century. The basic point here is that even though the US military is significantly less dependent overall on European defence products and designs than vice versa, if you rule out absolutely everything with a foreign connection, you're going to be in for a bad time. So what we're going to do today is compromise an approach that I think is restrictive, but still somewhat reasonable. We're not going to check every nut and bolt on every individual product to make sure the coat of paint isn't 30% American, but we are going to make sure the stuff isn't covered by ITAR, is manufactured substantially in Europe by a non-American company, and we won't allow more than the most basic modifications. Foreign equipment from some buyers localised in Europe, like the K2PL in Poland for example, is okay, but we're also not going to make up any new such arrangements where it doesn't already look like it's happening. And since the goal here is to select valid equipment, not necessarily the best equipment, the selection process used is going to be partially random. For each category, I took a large equipment database, filtered it down to stuff that might be relevant, ordered a list in various ways, sometimes alphabetically, sometimes by service entry year, in other cases by the first letter of the first word in the description box, and then went down the list striking out things we had a strong reason not to select before picking the first valid choice I hit, and then coming up with a way to sell it. So while I did set up the candidates, if you're wondering about any of the stuff that was eventually picked, it might be an RNG issue. Okay, that's more than enough rules and caveats. Let's design the EDF. And that starts with the usual big picture questions. What do we want our force to be able to do? And as a result, what equipment does it need? At a high level, I'm going to give our European Plus force 3 basic jobs. The first is the traditional deterrence and homeland defence role. The force needs to be able to deter, deny, and if necessary defeat any threat to Europe or its allies. Overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, that means convincing Russia that any move is a bad move, and being able to conventionally punt them out of Finland or the Baltic states if it comes to that. The second objective is the more civil and soft power role. We need the force to be able to support in civil emergencies, cover contingencies, maybe go overseas for peacekeeping operations. And then extending beyond that in a role that's quite new for most European militaries, we want to build a force that can project power. We need a force that can go and protect European and allied interests anywhere in the world, whether that be sea lane protection or conflict intervention, and I'll justify why that's in the brief a little bit later, and it's not just because I want a European carrier fleet. In any case, with those objectives in place, we can decide what sort of components our force is going to need. Given we share a neighbourhood with Russia, nuclear deterrence comes first. We're basically going to copy French nuclear doctrine on a larger scale and set 2 main requirements. A survivable second strike capability to underpin a primarily counter-value deterrent with some counter-force capability, so our opponents understand that almost no matter what, an unacceptable cost is always on the table. Then, for primarily warning shot purposes basically, we're going to want a pre-strategic air-delivered nuclear weapon. The ground forces are going to be a bit complicated because the 3 broad roles we have, territorial defence, civil support and power projection, often don't lend themselves to the same force design and equipment decisions. A small boutique professional force intended to fight overseas isn't going to give you the mass you need to fight off a Russian invasion. So what we're going to build instead is 3 separate components. A high-tier or volunteer active duty force to cover those overseas deployments and also so you have some troops on the border at all times. A regularly retrained specialised reserve that's going to include a lot of useful things for major contingencies, including civil contingencies like engineering units. And then we're going to have a Finland-style mass mobilisation reserve, with a large number of units that function as cadre and training forces during peacetime. In the event of wartime, those reservists are then called up, those units bulk out, and they can then add a lot more mass around that specialised reserve and active duty force. For the Air Force, other than presumably investing heavily in unmanned platforms, we're not going to do much unconventional here. Just accumulate the kind of tools we're going to need for the basic foreseeable missions. Air superiority, ground attack, fleet defence, suppression of enemy air defences, airlift, intelligence, etc. The Navy likewise has to have the sort of equipment to fit into those 3 broad roles. The home waters defence role, covering the likes of the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the North Sea and the Atlantic, with, given some of the nations involved, a particular nod to Arctic operations, and then alongside that mostly defensive role, the ability to do soft power operations and civil support, as well as hard power projection anywhere in the world, but at least as far as the Indian Ocean. And I'd argue part of the imperative there is just to reduce reliance on the United States, continuing to function as a kind of global guarantor of freedom of navigation. One of the things to come out of the recently leaked group chat, where senior members of the US administration were discussing strikes on Yemen, was just how much Washington's view of European and collective security has shifted. Senior members of the US administration reflected that Europe was more dependent on trade going through the Red Sea than the United States was, and expressed an enormous resentment of taking military action that would primarily benefit Europe. J.D. Vance, for example, is reported to have said, as you can see on the right there, quote, "I just hate bailing Europe out again," end quote. While SecDef Pete Hegseth is reported to have said, quote, "I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic," all caps. But Mike is correct, we're the only ones on the planet on our side of the ledger who can do this. Nobody else even comes close, end quote. A member of the chat simply marked SM then goes on to say, Quote, "As I heard it, the president was clear. Green light, but we soon make clear to Egypt and Europe what we expect in return. We also need to figure out how to enforce such a requirement, e.g. if Europe doesn't remunerate, then what? If the US successfully restores freedom of navigation at great cost, there needs to be some further economic gain extracted in return." End quote. Like it or not, in the modern security environment, it increasingly feels like if you want to be taken seriously as a great power and have a say in how events around the world unfold, you need to have the capacity, at least on paper, to go and influence them. And so in that context, to reduce strategic dependence on the United States, a European navy that can project power beyond European waters might be viewed as just an expensive necessity. So perhaps let's start there, picking the ship designs that are going to give Europe the kind of navy that'll put it squarely at the great power table. It's worth saying that compared to ground and air combat equipment, the lead time on acquiring new ships can be so long that this is perhaps going to be the most future-focused of any of our forces. Build times are a thing, so most of our targets are probably going to be in the 2030s through 2050s range. That starts with our primary surface combatants, the frigates and destroyers. We'll probably want an ASW frigate, a general-purpose frigate, maybe an air defence frigate, and I'm going to cover that requirement off by picking the FREM, the FREM, and the FREM respectively. The Fragata Europea Multimissione, because we're mostly leaning on the Italian version here, is, as the name suggests, a European multi-mission frigate. Apologies to any of my Italian listeners for the pronunciation, of course, but hey, you're about to get a bunch of jobs in the shipyards. It comes in a variety of versions, including general purpose, ASW, and anti-air warfare, and while it's nowhere near as heavily armed of ships like the American Arleigh Burke or the Chinese Type 55 destroyers, they're significantly cheaper, very flexible, European through and through, and frankly, probably good enough for a lot of the threats we're going to have to deal with. Hopefully not the Chinese or American navies, so much as the Russians or regional threats. I'll also note the ship was good enough that the United States Navy decided to pick it as the base for the new Constellation-class frigate, with the idea apparently being that a proven, off-the-shelf, relatively affordable design might be a good option for the US Navy to lower risk and crank out a lot of ships quickly. In the end, of course, though, the US Navy did what the US Navy does, and the FREM subsequently went from this to this in the course of becoming the Constellation, bloating in terms of cost, timeline, and waistline as it did so. But for our purposes today, we're sticking to the European original. If we do feel the FREMs need a little bit more anti-air backup, there's an option to add a couple of Horizon-class destroyers. Again, a Franco-Italian design, it brings a better sensor suite and a lot more anti-aircraft missile capability to the table, at the cost of a lot more cost. In 2016, when the Italians were paying less than 600 million euros per unit for the FREM, a Horizon came in at more than twice that, at about 1.5 billion. But if we're looking to add a bit more of an anti-aircraft bubble to each of our task forces, we could do worse than expanding their horizons. And while the ship has a much smaller missile load than the likes of the American Ticonderoga class, the Horizon has still proven itself useful in exactly the kind of mission that you would expect an EDF Navy to be able to do. Both Italian Horizons have done rotations through the Red Sea, dealing with the drone and missile threat, and I know at least one ship of the class, the Caio Duilio, is reported to have knocked down a number of drones using its gun systems without having to resort to missiles. The Italians are relatively famous for their rapid-firing naval gun systems, and the two Italian versions of this ship, which I'll call the Andrea Doria class, actually mount 3 rapid-firing 76mm, 2 forward-facing and 1 in the rear. Those can fire guided rounds, but the reports I saw suggest that they brought down those Houthi drones using much cheaper unguided ammunition. So even though these ships are primarily in our forces to provide a better air defence bubble and bring down things like tactical ballistic missiles with their Aster-30 interceptors, the gun-sensor combination means they might be quite useful for other employment scenarios as well, including potentially dealing with kamikaze drones, be they flying or surface. For a low-cost corvette for patrols and operations in places like the Mediterranean, I'm going to pick the Sigma from the Netherlands. Versions of this thing are currently operated by Indonesia, Morocco, and Mexico, and again, it's a very flexible, very affordable design that comes in plenty of different versions, while still having decent sensors, decent speed, and a gun, torpedo, and missile armament, so it's unlikely to be helpless against low or middle-tier threats. Plus, it does have a landing pad, which is potentially very useful for things like ASW work or for search and rescue. Adding to that conventional frigate, destroyer, corvette surface fleet, we're going to add a conventional submarine. The idea here is that for short-ranged operations in places like the Baltic Sea, the Mediterranean, or the North Sea, a good conventional boat can still be very, very dangerous while being much, much cheaper than a nuclear-powered Leviathan. I considered giving the Swedes a win here, but for a variety of reasons, in the end, we've gone with the Germans and the Type 212 CD U-boat. These are relatively large for conventional boats, about 2,800 tonnes submerged, but that extra displacement and the fact they're very, very new does buy you a lot of extra features. An air-independent propulsion system, 41 days endurance, more torpedoes, and potentially also IDAS. This is basically a system that allows you to pack up to 4 anti-aircraft missiles into a submarine's torpedo tube and then fire them against targets like submarine hunting helicopters while still being submerged. The initial contract to develop and build the first 6 submarines was valued at about 5.5 billion euros back in 2021, and the subs are actively being produced both for Germany and Norway. So if TKMS is willing to dial up those numbers a bit, we have our sub. Having rounded out the home fleet, so to speak, we now need to get up to the Arctic, and that really only takes 2 main additions. Firstly, Finland, as a global leader in the things, you're on unarmed icebreaker duty. Then for the armed Arctic patrol ships, we're going to tag in Norway. The Svalbard is an armed Norwegian Coast Guard icebreaker. The design is arguably most famous as the base for what became the very expensive and very delayed Canadian AOPS, which is kind of ironic given the original design was arguably perfectly functional and very cheap. Excluding the radar and helicopter, the Norwegians put this thing into service in 2001 for about $67 million US, meaning that if we produce a small fleet of these things and they end up being used for things that aren't necessarily Arctic patrol, they're cheap enough and easy to maintain enough that that's not necessarily a huge waste of resources. These things don't have the kind of missile armament that you'd want to fight a major action, but as a patrol vessel capable of Arctic operations, I think we found a way to tick Norway off our contracting list. But now that we've handled all that pesky home waters defence stuff, what about when Europe wants to be able to reach out and touch someone in a strategic sense? Here we're still going to need our same destroyers, frigates and corvettes, but we also have to start rolling out a couple of things from higher weight classes. We'll start with an LHD, or Landing Helicopter Dock. These are the ships that are going to carry your helicopters, your marines, their heavy equipment, your mobile hospitals, maybe your command centres, and potentially, where the ship is large enough, fixed-wing aircraft as well. The US Navy, for example, does this with its America-class amphibious assault ships. And roughly 45,000 tonnes, those can carry mixed air wings, including F-35s and helicopters, and shuffle a serious complement of Marines and their equipment basically anywhere in the world. For our part, we're going about half that size with the Spanish Juan Carlos class. This design, which was also licensed to the Royal Australian Navy, comes in at about 26,000 tonnes. It's capable of transporting a casual 900-plus troops and 46 main battle tanks. And choosing to purchase it would normally involve planners having to make a difficult choice. The Juan Carlos operates both helicopters, which are very useful for things like transport purposes, and fixed-wing aircraft. Think Harriers and F-35s. So normally a trade-off has to be made between what you want the ship's complement to be optimised for. The good news for us, though, is we don't have to make that trade-off. The bad news is it's because we've encountered our first real gap now that we've removed American weapon systems. Without access to the Harrier and the F-35, we no longer have access to a VTOL fighter. Remember, the Harrier was originally a British design, but the Spanish use a later American version, and all the British airframes are retired. That leaves our LHD operating helicopters only, although we might take a page out of the Turkish Navy's book and potentially make this thing a drone carrier as well. In terms of affordability, though, we're probably onto something. The Spanish reportedly had to pay about $600 million to commission this thing back in 2010, which makes them cheaper ton for ton than the American ships, albeit missing some of the features. Hopefully, if we order more, the Spanish should be able to bring those costs down and get our European Marines where they need to be. To augment those larger helicopter carriers, we'll also get some smaller LPDs or multi-mission ships. And specifically here, I'm thinking about the Damen Enforcer, built in the Netherlands. This is a very, very flexible ship design, which comes in multiple versions, and gives us a very flexible utility ship that can be used for a lot of purposes, including amphibious operations. It also gives the Dutch a second shipbuilding contract, so hopefully they're happy. Speaking of flexible designs, there's one way to make a lot of the ships we're purchasing even more flexible, and that's by adding some militarised Lego. Denmark's contribution to this entire naval build-up is going to be the cube system. If you remember the original concept for the American LCS, where there would be multi-mission modules that could be rapidly swapped out to turn the ship from a mine hunter into a surface combatant or whatever, Cube is basically that concept, but it actually works and fits in something the size of a standard shipping container. These don't intend to provide capabilities as advanced as those LCS mission modules, but they do essentially allow you to plug and play bolt-on extras depending on the mission profile. If you want to add more infirmary capacity or torpedo launchers, for example, you grab your ISO standard container off the truck or train that transported it, and as long as you've got a flat loading surface to work with, you're good to go. It's certainly not going to be applicable to all of our ships all of the time, but a handy extra for potentially making the most of what we have. It's already in use by both the Danes and the Brits, and so we also have a starting point of experience for a wider rollout. Clearly, though, there's something this intervention force is missing. Between the various shortfalls, including the absence of any VTOL jets, we're short on air cover, ground attack capacity, and massively deficient in the kind of drip and prestige that only one type of warship can really provide. So let's talk about our EDF carrier fleet. Here, European states currently operate a bit of a mishmash. The British Queen Elizabeth class, for example, might have been considered an attractive choice, but ultimately they're configured for a jet we don't have, the F-35, and if we're going to be forward-looking, we may as well go all the way. France is currently planning to build a single, roughly 75,000-tonne displacement nuclear-powered carrier, the PANG. That would give them a one-to-one replacement for the existing Charles de Gaulle and an absolute absence of any kind of economy of scale. Instead, we're going to work for a bit more continuous construction and build up to a European fleet of at least 4. That might sound like a lot of commitment, but thought about another way, it's really only one carrier each for each of the United Kingdom, France, Germany and Italy. And in terms of displacement, it's really only equivalent to about 3 American Fords. So we're targeting a carrier fleet between a quarter and a third of the USN equivalent. 4 is a useful number both from an economies of scale perspective, but also from a deployability perspective. With 1 or 2 carriers, there'll be significant chunks of time where you simply don't have one available, and your enemy is going to know it. But with 4, you could expect to have 1 deployed at all times, and be able to surge up to 2 or 3 if the shit really hit the fan. Plus, you could potentially economise on air wings, having perhaps 3 to cover the 4 ships, rather than having to have 1 to 1, with the pilots presumably not doing much power projection outside the local pubs whenever the ship's in dry dock. The CVN fleet would give our EDF a truly global reach, potentially give Europe a larger seat at the table for global events, and help solve that whole lack of air cover problem we discussed a moment ago due to our complete absence of any VTOL fighters. Unfortunately, from an industrial distribution perspective, having just won the nuclear carrier contract, the French are about to sweep a whole bunch of other categories the same way, by default. Without the F-35 or Harrier, in the near term, we only have one option for a carrier-rated fighter, the French Rafale. And likewise, beyond that, we're likely to only have access to one next-generation carrier fighter. This is the Franco-Spanish-German SCAF, which we've discussed in the past, and at the moment, it's the only fighter on the radar, or not, given its stealth features, to potentially replace the Rafale at sea, likely sometime in the 2040s. And presumably to Paris's glee, the French default wins are going to continue for at least a couple more slides, as we cover off basically everything nuclear, with the key issue here being a lack of choice. We only have 2 nuclear-armed states in our roster, the UK and France, and while the UK does have a lot of sovereign capability, there's usually just enough American in any given system to rule it out of consideration. I would really have liked to give a contract to the next generation UK-Australian attack boat, for example, the SSN AUKUS, but that idea was pretty thoroughly torpedoed by statements like this from the UK MOD. Quote, SSN AUKUS will incorporate US technology, such as propulsion plant systems and components, a common vertical launch system, and weapons. The AUKUS partners will also develop a joint combat system as an expansion of the existing US-Australian combat system. End quote. So no matter how good the UK nuclear designs are, we're having to go back to the French. That makes our nuclear attack submarine for global use the French Suffren class, which has the advantage of being very new. The first one was commissioned in 2020, currently in production, so the lines are active, and generally in keeping with the trend we've identified for a couple of ship types now, where the design is smaller and cheaper than the American equivalent. Across some of the key dimensions, you can basically divide by 2. An American Virginia class with the payload module displaces about 10,000 tonnes submerged. Suffren is closer to 5,000. The Virginia has a complement of just over 130, Suffren 60. And while a moduled Virginia comes in north of $4 billion per unit, adjusted for inflation, the French boat is closer to $2 billion. So if our goal is to maximise presence rather than the sheer combat power of every submarine out there, the smaller, more economical design might be a better fit for our requirements anyway, given that one of the major advantages that nuclear attack submarines might provide us is that because they could be anywhere, they might help force our opponents to act like they are everywhere, meaning everything critical probably needs at least some ASW protection. Having more cheaper subs on patrol might provide us greater advantages than a smaller number of more expensive ones. Then, while we're talking nuclear propulsion, we may as well cover the nuclear deterrent. It's probably not worth buying an older ballistic missile submarine because both the French and the British have already cut steel on their next generation. That means we're going to be operating France's SNLE-3G, or third generation nuclear ballistic missile submarine, probably scaling up the French order for 4 to 8 or 12, and expecting the first boat to arrive around 2035. And each of those will be capable of carrying up to 16 M51 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. By SLBM standards, this is a relatively new design, first entering service in 2010, with likely the main advantage over the previous M45 being an increase in range. We've seen the missile publicly tested to at least 6,000 kilometres range, and it's believed to be capable of 8 to 10,000. The reason that matters is because it affects where the submarines can potentially shelter while still taking effective shots against the enemy homeland. With that kind of range, for example, you could lob a nuke to North Korea or into the American Great Lakes while taking the shot from the Mediterranean. Assuming then, in the event of a crisis, that the EDF just bottles up the Mediterranean at its 3 relevant choke points and declares Mare Nostrum, It'd be a pretty big ask for a lot of opposing sub-hunting assets to try and get into the Med and potentially hunt the boomers. That's not to say the subs would have to hide there, but the extra range on the missiles does potentially give them the option. Meanwhile, for our air-delivered pre-strategic nuclear weapon, in the near term we'll keep France's ASMPA nuclear cruise missile, and in the future adopt the planned replacement for the ASMPA, the ASN-4G, which has a very similar use case to the present missile, but it's hypersonic, potentially reducing both warning time and the probability of interception. It is worth noting here that even with all these systems, there's a pretty massive gap between our European nuclear force and those of Russia, China and the United States. We don't have a triad. Europe doesn't have a land-based ICBM, silo or mobile, that we can use for a ground-based leg, and as we'll flag a little bit later, we don't have a long-range strategic bomber, meaning we're dependent on carrier aviation in order to get our nukes where they need to be. That's one of the first clear limitations we've encountered without access to American options, but we'll circle back to it a little bit later. But suffice to say, at this point in the piece, Paris and Rome are probably feeling pretty good about this whole EDF process. France got a clean sweep on all of our nuclear contracts, and Italy did pretty well at sea. And so to help balance things out, with a couple of exceptions, both are going on the blacklist from here on. We'll turn to them when we have literally no other choice, but it's time to get the rest of Europe access to that money pile. And so to help redress the contract balance a bit, let's buy some aircraft. For our ground-based multi-role fighter and our electronic warfare aircraft, our only option really is the Eurofighter. We've got the Rafales on carrier and nuclear duty, although they can obviously double up as ground-based fighters as well. But the F-35 is out, older Warsaw Pact era fighters are out, and the Swedish Griffin is unfortunately ruled out by its American engine. So the multinational fourth-generation Eurofighter is going to have to serve as our equivalent to the F-16, the F-15C, and a couple more besides. Despite the lack of competition for the slot though, that doesn't mean the Eurofighter isn't a great choice. It's a capable, agile, twin-engine fourth-generation fighter that draws heavily on European industry, including in the UK, Spain, Italy and Germany. It integrates some very effective weapon systems and has had a number of export successes, leaving it at its core from a procurement perspective, suffering two main drawbacks. They lack some of the fifth-generation features like stealth that you associate with aircraft like the F-35, while also costing as much or more than the F-35 to purchase, if not to operate. Our tanker of choice is also a fairly multinational design, the Airbus A330 MRTT+, which is the upcoming version of this already quite successful transporter/tanker, which was announced at the Farnborough Air Show back in 2024 and is based on the A330-800. For our purposes, it's attractive because it's European, relatively proven and flexible because it can be used both as a tanker and a conventional transport, and because it allows us to start engaging a wider supply chain, including critically, Rolls-Royce engines. Mid-air refueling is one of those capability areas where the US has a much, much larger relevant inventory than the rest of the NATO allies, and we've already seen some European steps to start addressing that deficit. Even without creating our hypothetical EDF, for example, Europe already has a very real European air refueling pool, where countries essentially pool their resources to build up a European tanker fleet, and then essentially operate on a kind of timeshare basis. One Danish figure recently talked about potentially joining that program, firstly by buying air refueling hours, and eventually buying a share equivalent to 2 entire tankers. So this is already essentially a work in progress that our EDF can build upon. Another enabler area where the US has an outsized share of the overall allied capability is airborne early warning and control. Unfortunately, in our reality, NATO's choice for its next-generation AWACS aircraft is the Boeing E-7 Wedgetail, which is obviously a non-starter for our EDF, but also an opportunity. Because here we get to cross off one of the harder items on our list, a partially Canadian defence purchase. This is Saab's GlobalEye AEWC aircraft. Obviously a smaller, cheaper and more compact aircraft than the likes of the E3 or the E7, but for most likely European scenarios, especially against Russia, arguably very much fit for purpose. It's relatively new, in current production, already in service with the UAE, and while it uses Swedish sensors and a Swedish prime contractor, the aircraft itself is essentially a Canadian Bombardier business jet, manufactured in Canada, and thankfully, using Rolls-Royce engines. So yeah, apparently the secret to buying a cost-effective defence product from Canada is to actually buy a civilian product and then get someone else to militarise it. Either way, we now have Toronto written into our European procurement plan. What we don't have written in, as I said earlier, is a strategic bomber. And in terms of options for them, we don't have any. There are active designs from the United States, People's Republic of China, and Soviet Union/Russian Federation, none of which fits within the bounds of our European procurement model. Operating without a dedicated crater maker probably isn't fatal to the capabilities of our EDF-AF, given its likely missions, but it does potentially make us even more reliant on the Navy, its carriers and its cruise missiles to project power over longer distances. One imperfect workaround would be to adapt the American Rapid Dragon concept. We take two things Europe does have, cargo aircraft and cruise missiles, and shove pallets of the latter out the back of the former. But as far as an actual one-to-one equivalent, here I think we're going to have to admit defeat and accept the Russians and Americans win this round. But now we're partway through an entire another section, and you're probably still noticing a pretty stark omission. Where is the UK in all this? We've been handing out contracts to the French and Italians like they're supermarket-free samples. But what about NATO's third largest economy? The basic issue, at least for our purposes today, is that the UK arms sector has a problem. Most of its products just have far too much American DNA, whether that's warship designs we might otherwise want to buy, or armoured vehicles like the Ajax here, where an American company, General Dynamics Land Systems, is actually the relevant prime contractor. Make no mistake, there's a lot of defence industrial capacity in the UK we want to use in order to build up Euro 4, but to date, the UK has often been keen to let the Americans into their weapons projects, while also getting contracts to supply into American ones. BAE, after all, is a major supplier for the US military. But for any Brits listening, don't worry, I have a plan, and it doesn't involve the unacceptable pain of just giving the French a win. Instead, we're going to give the UK two jobs. Firstly, as well as building and maintaining part of the existing Eurofighter fleet, you're also going to take the lead on Europe's next-generation ground-based fighter. With the F-35 ruled out, waiting until 2045 to get access to the SCAF 6th-generation fighter probably doesn't seem like a fantastic option. Tempest, though, is meant to have an initial operating capability in about a decade. At the moment, there are three main partners in the GCAP program, the UK, Italy and Japan, with Saudi Arabia also reportedly interested, and the Royal Australian Air Force reportedly having received an informational briefing. But in our hypothetical, Tempest isn't a trilateral fighter, it's a true European fighter, or Eurofighter if you will. And assuming the intention is there to purchase it on that alliance-wide scale, the probability the resources are there to actually complete the program and get the plane built probably goes up. And while we don't know the capabilities of the final design yet, if it works as intended, it's almost certainly going to outmatch the capabilities of any current or anticipated near-future Russian products. But long before Tempest arrives, the Brits still have a job for the EDF. You're all going to get jobs in the missile factories until people think MBDA stands for Make Britain Dangerous Again. Because Ukraine has unambiguously taught us that magazine depth and munition capability matters, and the UK is pretty good at making the kind of things that we want to fill those magazines with. Firstly, for our high-end manpads option, we're going Starstreak. This thing can huck 3 beam-riding submunitions at speeds greater than Mach 4 against air targets 7 kilometres away. In most respects, the capability comparison of things like Stinger isn't even close, and you can crank these things out in Belfast. Its companion piece, if you will, is going to be the Martlet missile, also a Northern Ireland special, and this thing is being used by troops, mounted on Royal Navy helicopters, and a casual 5,000 of the things have been ordered for eventual delivery to Ukraine. Why? Because unlike the Starstreak, the Martlet sacrifices some of that insane speed and those 3 submunitions to instead be considerably cheaper and mount a large proximity detonating warhead. In Ukraine, those characteristics have made the Martlet a drone killer, and so given what the future battlefield is likely to look like, we're going to stock up. It's also worth noting that unlike a lot of older missiles like Stinger that use IR seekers, Starstreak and Martlet are both laser-guided. That means they're going to be completely immune to things like IR countermeasures, and they can't be suppressed with anti-radiation missiles. If we do want an IR-seeking manpads as well though, just so our opponents have to plan for it, we can also pick up the Polish Piorun, or Perun, that entered service in 2019 and sprinkle them throughout the force. Going back to the United Kingdom then, we'll also round out the Belfast stimulus package by ordering NLAW as one of our shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, given it may not have the range of things like Javelin, but it's cheaper, more mobile, and easier to train on. Especially for our reserve units, it might be a decent option alongside things like drones and loitering munitions when it comes to anti-armour work. We'll probably want to pair that with a longer-ranged fire-and-forget ATGM, and unfortunately for our industrial balancing plans, if the goal is to try and avoid American and Israeli imports as much as possible, this is going to have to be one of our 2 remaining exceptions to the no more French contracts rule. This is a very new missile which first entered service in 2018, and in some respects it shows it. Unlike some other systems, the IR sensor on the Acheron isn't cooled, which saves a lot of logistical headache, and it's also capable of what's called lock-on after-launch operation, where you fire the missile without having a lock on the target, perhaps because you don't have line of sight to it, but once the missile's in the air, you can get that lock and service the target. In a sense, you can think of it as pushing the capabilities of an anti-tank missile and a drone or loitering munition closer together. After making that buy from MBD France though, we can get back to MBDA UK. Our long-range air-to-air missile of choice, for example, is going to be the Meteor. Despite its cost, there's an argument to be made that the Meteor is the best air-to-air missile in its size class currently in service anywhere. The ramjet propulsion systems means more range, better performance from low altitude, a larger no-escape zone, and a degree of kinematic performance that borders on cheating. Against the likes of PL-15 or the newest American AMRAAMs, Meteor probably has an edge. And against a lot of the Russian inventory, the gap only widens. The two challenges then are going to be A, cranking out enough of these things for economies of scale to do their work in bringing down that painful sticker price, and secondly, finding good shorter-ranged options to cover different range brackets. To that end, we're actually going to roll with two different dogfighting missiles to serve as our analogue to the American AIM-9 Sidewinder. Firstly, Britain's Advanced Short-Range Air-to-Air Missile, or ASRAAM. Originally, this missile would have been out of bounds due to its Raytheon seeker, but as of Block 6, it's now ITAR-free. It's a very agile missile, which we've seen make over-the-shoulder shots, but it's also believed to have a maximum range beyond the publicly acknowledged 25 kilometres, and it's very closely related to a ground-based version that's likely to be used by both our Army and Navy, the CAM, or Common Anti-Air Modular Missile. The Ukrainians have already gotten some use out of this thing in the ground-launched role, so by maintaining and scaling up production, we're also going to be bulking up the industry behind some of our ground-based and naval air defence systems. For similar reasons, we'll also pick up the somewhat newer IRIS-T, which came out of a multinational program led by Germany, once again with an intention of replacing the AIM-9 Sidewinder, and which first entered service in the air-to-air role in 2005. Here, you're looking at an almost insanely manoeuvrable missile, complete with thrust vectoring and an imaging infrared seeker, that brings together technology from several of the contributing countries. The rocket engine, for example, is produced by a Norwegian firm. A reason to potentially pick it up along with the ASRAAM, though, as well as taking advantage of existing production lines and the fact that it's also used as a ground-launched missile, is that the missile is very flexible, having been tested against ground targets by the Royal Norwegian Air Force, and also in a self-defend mode. The manufacturer claims that it has, quote, anti-missile capability against incoming air-to-air and surface-to-air missiles, end quote, meaning that should worst come to worst, our pilots might have one more line of defence against being shot down. Without the F-35 in inventory, the EDF is going to have to lean more on its fourth gens. Using non-stealthy platforms at the leading edge obviously increases the odds of getting shot at, and even if a self-defend missile isn't the most proven or reliable defensive option, it's at least an option that might help patch our survivability a little until the 6th generation airframes start arriving. Presuming our jets survive then, and can clear the skies of the Sukhois and MiGs opposing them, we then have to consider the kind of offensive ordnance that might allow them to actually impact the ground or naval fight. Here, I'm going to assume that if you watch the channel, you're probably across a lot of the existing options. Hammer rocket-propelled bombs, the Scalp/Storm Shadow cruise missile. And so given the timelines involved in building up the EDF-AF, I think it's better to focus on future options. Starting with the larger option, there is, you guessed it, a multinational MBDA program. This is the UK-French-Italian future cruise/anti-ship weapon, which is being tested at the moment, but is actually two different missiles. A stealthy subsonic cruise missile, presumably analogous to the American AGM-158, for example, and a supersonic option that trades more speed for less stealth. If either or both of these missiles made it into production, it would cover off the requirement for a long-ranged air-launched precision weapon, covering off anti-shipping as well as ground attack duties. Just like Storm Shadow, however, there are a lot of targets where it would represent massive overkill, so we probably want something smaller as well. There is a family of munitions currently in development intended to fill that requirement, along with things like the anti-radiation role for hunting opposing air defence radars, another MBDA program you'll commonly hear referred to as Spear 3. But while it would probably be perfect for the EDF, once again we're shit out of luck, because reportedly Spear 3 is meant to be powered by a Pratt & Whitney TJ150 engine, and since we're not allowed to bend the rules to replace the motor, it's out. That potentially represents a gap and might force our EDF to be more creative with the weapon set it currently has, as well as those new cruise missiles. That brings us to the service, which is going to force us to make more selections than both the Air Force and the Navy combined. And that's even if you don't count some of those extra missile systems I snuck in for the Army earlier on. As it is, our contracts so far have skewed pretty heavily towards some heavy hitters like France, the UK and Italy, but for most of our ground systems, we are going to be looking elsewhere. Almost as important as balancing the politics of contract award, however, is designing a force that actually does what we want it to do. And here, from an equipment selection perspective, we run into a bit of an issue. For our active duty combat formations that have to be ready at all times or able to deploy overseas, quality is probably the name of the game. That means we're often going to want to buy fairly top-of-the-range, very expensive kit, which, spoiler alert, is often synonymous with a thing coming with a Made in Germany sticker. But we might not be capable of handing out that kind of kit to every formation, nor manufacturing it in every existing factory. And even if we could, you might question the wisdom of buying a lot of very complex, very expensive equipment that's going to spend most of its time in storage to be used by reservists if mobilisation ever becomes necessary. Because we're creating a multi-tier force then, I think it makes sense to adopt a multi-tier equipment model. Depending on the system type, we might want one or two higher-end designs, And then to make up the mass for those weekend warriors, something simpler and cheaper. As a side effect, that should also enable us to spread the contracts around a little more without sacrificing too much scale overall. If we're going to need tens of thousands of APCs, for example, we can probably get acceptable scale without adopting just one single design. To kick off with the main battle tanks then, we get our first vengeance against the Brits, the French and the Italians for all the contracts they received earlier by effectively demoting Challenger, Leclerc and C1 and standardising on what are likely to be two of the more common tank families in Europe, Leopard 2 and K2. Leopard 2 dates back to 1979, while the first K2s came along in 2014. But if we're going to encourage the various users over time to adopt a similar standard, the versions we'd probably go to are the Leopard 2 A8, which has already been ordered by a number of European countries and includes a range of improvements, including an active protection system, which unfortunately for the moment is a version of the Israeli trophy system, and then the planned Polish-specific, Polish-produced version of the South Korean K2, the K2PL. Notably, K2 also comes with the option for an active protection system, which I'm considering pretty important on a modern drone and loitering munitions saturated battlefield. But in that case, the option is CAPS, the Korean active protection system. So at least if one of our foreign industrial partners does decide to cut us off, it's likely not going to affect the entire tank force, and there might be an option to integrate the other system. Now it's at this point that some of the industrial pain we're going to be inflicting with these choices is probably becoming more obvious. By picking just these two vehicles, we are essentially saying to countries like Britain, like France, that have carefully protected their ability to produce their own indigenous tank designs for decades at this point, I'm sorry, your services are no longer required, and if you're going to keep building tanks, it's either going to be for export or someone else's design. But unless we're willing to do that, any effort to achieve any kind of standardization or scale in the EDF's equipment park is going to be doomed to failure. The Texas and California National Guard don't get to have different types of tanks because they'd like to design their own. And so unfortunately, in order to achieve scale, we're going to have to make sacrifices. To that end, even though it gives us a chance to make another country happy, I'm going to pass on picking a specific reserve MBT. Instead, to be practical about it, given our limited resources, we're going to push a lot of our active NATO main battle tanks, think Abrams, Challenger, etc., down to reserve status, mothballing some of them, stockpiling as many spare parts as possible, where hopefully, combined with the right training practices, maintenance and simulator use, they won't wear down as quickly as the active duty tanks. With any luck and some back-of-the-envelope math, I think that adds up to the EDF being able to create more than half a dozen good reserve armour brigades without having to buy new vehicles specifically for the purpose and still keeping some in storage for cannibalisation or reactivation. And when eventually we go to a single next-generation system to replace both the Leopard and the K2PL, we might then start to push those vehicles either to our allies or to our reserves. The next category is infantry fighting vehicles, which takes in platforms like the Bradley, which has proven so useful in Ukraine. The good news is that Europe has a bunch of IFE designs. The bad news is a lot of them can be ruled out for having too much American content. Sometimes it's an American transmission, sometimes an American Bushmaster main gun, but moving through system after system, there's a bunch I had to strike out. In the end though, as with a lot of these vehicles, as you're about to see, the Germans come through for us. Rheinmetall's Lynx is a very modern infantry fighting vehicle that first entered service with the Hungarian military in 2024. It has a German autocannon, a German transmission, a German engine, can be fitted with the German APS, is currently being produced and has been selected by both Hungary and Italy. And if you want a rough shorthand indicator for where this vehicle might sit in terms of modernity and capability, American Rheinmetall actually put the vehicle forward in the concept phase for the program to replace the American Bradley. It was also sent to Australia to compete for our IFE contract, so I can at least vouch for the comfort of the seats compared to some of the other vehicles on the market. Obviously, any final version of the XM30, which is what's meant to replace the Bradley, would look very different to the vehicle that went into that first concept phase. But as of 2023, Rheinmetall was pretty clear that they were still in the XM30 race. Another reason to pick up the Lynx, beyond just the pain it will cause the accountants, is the fact the first factory is in Hungary, meaning despite the high German content, that's a country we can cross off the list. Then to go with our tracked IFE, I figured we had a requirement for a wheeled infantry fighting vehicle and probably a wheeled APC, maybe a wheeled reconnaissance vehicle, wheeled utility vehicles of various kinds, like combat ambulances for example, which thankfully we can all get from various versions of Germany's Boxer. A very imperfect comparison would be to say that the Boxer in its APC version is similar to America's Striker, but it's been Legoed into a variety of different configurations, and while yes, as a German vehicle it is quite expensive, we can draw on a large existing fleet, an active and running production line, including one in Australia, if Europe in this scenario needed more vehicles than it can produce itself. And there's potentially a lot of logistics, maintenance, and scale advantages to be realised by covering a lot of our requirements using a single vehicle family. That said, depending on the version, this is easily a millions of euros per unit vehicle. So if some units can use a cheaper system for their battle taxi or IFV needs, that probably deserves looking at. So what we really need in the reserve wheeled category then is less high-cost German sci-fi shit and more just a couple of versions of the metal box on wheels concept. And those provide an option to throw some contracts to the Finns. For higher risk roles, we've got the more heavily armoured Patria 8x8 AMV, which is here more to provide us access to more existing production lines and inventory than sheer cost savings per se. And for lower risk duties, the new 6x6 that first entered service in 2021. Part of the key here, as well as the vehicles just being cheaper, is that just like with the Boxer family, we can cover off a lot of different roles with two basic vehicle families. If you have a 6x6 that is never going to see the enemy, you probably don't need to add the expense of a remote weapon station on top. Meanwhile, you can configure that AMV to be everything from an armoured personnel carrier to a twin mortar carrier. I'm serious, here it is with the twin-barreled advanced mortar system, or AMOS, which on paper can lob between 12 and 16 120mm mortar bombs out to a range of about 10 kilometres every minute, meaning that even if we classify these primarily as reserve vehicles, there might actually be some use for them in the active duty formations. Both these vehicles are actively being produced and have been ordered in large numbers. For the 6x6, Latvia and Sweden have ordered nearly 600 vehicles between them, and Germany plans to eventually acquire 1,000. The AMV is also widely used and forms the basis of Poland's licensed-manufactured Rosa mark. So compared to comparator nations, we get the advantage of some fairly modern vehicles in active production, with significant cost savings whenever we can use the 6x6. And on that note, by this point you might have noticed the designs I'm picking here are often more recent than their American equivalents. The massive fragmentation of Europe's defence industry and its procurement efforts comes with a huge array of disadvantages. There is a lot of inefficiency, there is a lot of waste, there is a lot of difficulty accessing scale. But from our perspective today, it does kind of come with one collateral benefit. Compared to the United States, Europe doesn't have scale because different countries are all doing their own things at different times. But in part because all those nations are off doing their own thing at different times, there are just a much larger number of vehicles designed and a much larger number of modernisation programs. Which means at any given time there are comparatively better odds that some producer somewhere in Europe will probably have come up with a much more recent clean sheet design than their American competitors. For the US, the correct approach is usually just to upgrade existing systems until you can't upgrade them no more and then begrudgingly design a replacement. That same logic can hold true in Europe too, but different countries hit that replacement threshold at different times, meaning that often throughout this episode I have the option to go for a system or a platform that was designed much more recently than its American or Russian competitor. And while yes, upgrades can accomplish a lot, sometimes starting with a clean slate can have its advantages. For tracked self-propelled artillery, for example, the first version of the American M109 entered service in 1963, and after numerous failed replacement programs has continued to be upgraded time and time again. The two vehicles we're going to go with for the EDF originate in the late 1990s, the Panzerhaubitze 2000 from Germany, and the K9, which originally entered service in Korea in 1999, but we'll be selecting the upgraded Polish-built version, K9PL. Between the two vehicles, the German design is heavier, much better protected, more expensive, and has a fast-firing autoloader. In Ukraine, we've seen evidence of the PZH 2000 appearing to shrug off hits from weapon systems that might have thoroughly destroyed other SPGs. But with it comes a combat weight of close to 56 tonnes, and an eye-watering purchase cost that might be around 18 million euros per unit, a lot for what will essentially be an interim system. By contrast, the K9 is going to be a bit lighter, a bit cheaper, but not have that rapid autoloader nor the same level of protection. Both, however, have a significant advantage over the American system and a lot of their international competitors. They have a longer gun, and so all else being equal, they can shoot further. K9 and PZH 2000 use 52 caliber guns, so roughly 8 metres long, while the American system is still a 39 caliber gun, roughly 6 metres. And environments like Ukraine, or facing off against shorter range artillery systems like a lot of Russian 152mm guns, that extra reach might be very, very useful, especially when you account for the fact that European companies produce some interesting kinds of extreme range ammunition. In the long term, the goal would probably be to pare down to just one kind of tracked self-propelled gun, but given most of those programs are still relatively fuzzy at the moment, I don't think we can pick a winner just yet. What I do think we can pick are our wheeled self-propelled guns. From a first principles perspective, a lot of the normal tracked versus wheeled arguments apply here, with wheeled systems very generally being cheaper, lighter, and faster across certain types of terrain, but less forgiving over difficult terrain. There really isn't a currently serving American equivalent in this equipment category, but a lot of European militaries are already in the process of moving in this direction. Some countries like France and Sweden, for example, have gone all-wheeled for their self-propelled guns, and the Bundeswehr's intended successor to the old tracked PZH-2000 is the wheeled RCH-155, which I believe first entered combat service 2 months ago, with Ukraine its first user. As far as SPGs worldwide, this is about as blingy as it gets. It has an unmanned turret and autoloader that cuts the required crew to 2. Like many howitzers, it can achieve multiple rounds simultaneous impact by firing multiple shells on different trajectories so they all hit the target at the same time. But unlike other howitzers, it's advertised as being able to effectively fire on the move. That obviously complicates counter-battery warfare because by the time the enemy has detected your rounds and fired back, you're already somewhere else. And it needs to be said that while it could technically be operated in a direct fire mode, operating as a kind of ersatz slightly armoured but very heavily armed tank, considering it can sling long-range rounds out past the 50-kilometre mark, if it is operating in direct fire mode, something has probably gone wrong. Oh, and in case I didn't mention, it can reportedly clock around 100 kilometres or 60 miles per hour on a road, while being cheaper than the PZH-2000 it's meant to replace. It is still hideously expensive though, so we're going to want a reserve tier option, and in the end, the RNG generator knocked off a variety of competitors, including the Slovak Zuzana 2, which also offered an auto-loading 52 caliber gun in a significantly cheaper package, and landed on something even cheaper and more available, the 2S22 Bodana from Ukraine. At its core, it's a Ukrainian 155mm 52 caliber gun on a truck, most often a Czech chassis, which is why I've marked them as a secondary industrial partner here. Bodana's selling point is that it gives our reserve units access to a simple, mobile, long-ranged indirect fire system that is currently, according to the Ukrainians, being produced at a rate faster than any other European SPG, for a quoted unit cost, with all the caveats that come with that, of only about 2.5 million per, meaning an entire battery of these things might be priced more cheaply than a single RCH-155. Plus, Ukrainian production capacity is there, we may as well use it. In order to balance things out then, after that artillery pick, we're going to hand a large ammunition production contract to Bratislava. Realistically, we'll need all the 155mm rounds that Europe can currently produce, but we're also going to want to fund additional expansions. The country currently produces a wide array of large caliber ammunition, from mortars to 155, and reportedly, ZVS recently opened a new production line for 155mm shells, which is intended to lift their production to about 360,000 shells per year by 2026. With additional EDF contracts going forward, I'm sure they can do better, while also ramping up output of things like propellant charges. Moving on to rocket artillery, we go from having plenty of options to being much more constrained, because so many of the NATO-style rocket artillery systems that European countries rely on derive either from the American M270 or from HIMARS, and are often dependent on either American or Israeli-designed rockets. Luckily, thanks to their deal with Seoul, Poland has an out for us in the form of their version of the Korean K239. This thing would require the EDF to switch over to a whole new family of rockets, but on the plus side, those stretch all the way from small, unguided, short-range projectiles through to full-on ATACMS-style TBMs with an ever-expanding range. Basically, we gain access to the pod-style system with a wider family of available missiles, at the expense of losing access to the tracked option, the M270, and the likes of proven American rockets like Gimlers and ATACMS. For second-line duty, we're going to buy off Romania by purchasing their LaRom MRL, which you can basically think of as a modernised Grad-style system that can also fire much longer-ranged Israeli rockets. We should probably assume we don't have reliable access to those Israeli rockets, however, so it might be worth looking for an alternative. Serbia, for example, manufactures the ER Grad 2000 rockets, which roughly double the range of the Grad system out to 40 kilometres. We've seen them used in Ukraine, with anecdotally some good reviews, but unfortunately for us, Serbia is neither in the European Union nor NATO, so getting access to them will presumably depend either on a commercial agreement and not loaning the Croatians a couple of divisions when they say they'd be happy to go get the rockets for us. That covers off a lot of our indirect fires, so let's talk ground-based air defence. There is currently a major European air defence initiative, kicked off by Germany, called European Sky Shield. As at time of recording, I think there are 24 members, and the goal is broadly to develop an integrated, multi-layered air defence system, including everything from short-range air defences all the way up to exo-atmospheric interceptors. It's a clear illustration about the potential for European cooperation, and we're going to cancel the shit out of it. Because while it relies on short and medium-range European systems, the long-range option is the American Patriot, and the very long-range option, the Israeli Arrow 3. For the EDF, that's a non-starter. For short-ranged air defences, at least until lasers and high-powered microwaves become more viable, we're going to go with Sky Ranger. This isn't a vehicle so much as a turret and system that you can fit to them, which gives the military more options in terms of where and how they want to integrate them into the rest of the force. Putting them on the Boxer chassis, for example, would probably be a logical start. The Sky Ranger version we're probably most interested in combines a 30mm cannon with specialised ammunition and a couple of anti-air missiles for targets that can't be readily serviced by the cannon. Where this is potentially going to be important is not just defence against traditional threats like helicopters, but also the swarms of loitering munitions and drones that we might encounter, without having to depend entirely on things like missiles and intercept drones. For slightly longer range duties, we'll take the ground-based versions of some of our air-to-air missiles, launching the CAM from the British Sky Sabre and the IRIS-T from the German IRIS-T. The IRIS-T in particular has received decent reviews in Ukraine so far, and the commonalities with our air-to-air missile production lines are obviously an advantage. Unfortunately, the Norwegian NASAMS is out in this category because it relies on firing American Sidewinders and AMRAAMs. Finally, for our longer range system, conveniently, the first of the next generation version of the SAM-T are due for delivery in 2025. And with the American Patriot off the table, we once again turn to a Franco-Italian system. To greatly oversimplify, SAM-T is basically what happens when you come up with a ground-based vertical launch system for the Aster-30 missile, which coincidentally is also being used by a lot of the EDF's warships, and then include it with all the other elements you need, including a very powerful AESA radar, to turn it into a functional ground-based air defence system. MBDA claims the system can operate against fixed-wing targets out to about 150 kilometres, and provided a battery commander with the maximum 6 launches is willing to cause deep emotional distress to some distant accountant, on paper, the system can salvo 56 interceptor missiles in 10 seconds. I'm not sure I'd be willing to say that SAM-T NG and the most modern versions of Patriot are directly equivalent systems. But as a European solution to primarily Russia-derived security threats, SAM-T NG is probably the obvious solution, and it gives us a chance to go in all in even harder on the Aster-30 as one of our primary missiles. That pretty much rounds out most of our heavy equipment, but we don't have every country covered yet, so we'll hand out a few more contracts equipping the soldiers themselves. And as a thanks here, these selections actually come courtesy of Tex, of BPL and Tex Talks Battletech fame, who as well as being a good mate, is also a bit of a small arms expert. For service rifles, we're going to buy both a standard and bullpup option. The conventional system is going to be the Czech CZ Bren, which has been well reviewed in Ukraine, and more importantly is very easy to quickly reconfigure between 5.56mm NATO and Soviet standard 7.62x39. That means countries with access to large stocks of older ammunition can use them, productive capacity for older ammunition is useful, and if we need to transfer these rifles somewhere else in the world to a country that doesn't use 5.56, switching some of the rifles over might be quicker than buying new weapons. The bullpup you can see being used by Ian there is the VHS-2, which both ticks Zagreb off the list and gives us a bullpup for units that like bullpups. To our Czech and Croatian rifles, we'll add the Belgian FN Mag machine gun because everyone uses it, the Swedish Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle because everyone uses it, the Greek E44 and E56 mortars because they both work and I need something from Greece, and then for longer range options we'll go the designated marksman version of the CZ Bren, while grabbing our bolt-action sniper rifles from Finland. For pistols, Tex told me to buy Glocks, but I'm going to ignore him and get the Rex 01 from Slovenia instead, because it's from Slovenia. And if we're taking the Oprah Winfrey approach to contracting, this is probably a pretty good way to do it. Then, based on what we've seen in Ukraine, the EDF is probably going to want a hefty inventory of unmanned ground vehicles, UGVs. Fortunately, one of the more recognisable names in the field, whose systems have gone to Ukraine, is Milrem Robotics, and they're based in Estonia. So we can get them started on UGVs for everything from resupply and medical evacuation, through to reconnaissance and frontline combat duties, while also crossing a Baltic state off our to-do list. As for the other Baltic states, given their positioning and strategic importance, I can't think of anywhere better to set up some serious maintenance facilities to support all of the heavy metal we're going to be stationing on the Russian border. Lithuania, for example, has already been involved in the repair of PZH-2000s for Ukraine. Meanwhile, for UAS and loitering munitions, the EDF should probably aim to become a world leader. But the technology and systems available are changing so quickly, and a lot of it is currently still so sensitive, that it feels a bit odd to pick just one or two winners. Fortunately, Europe has an array of relevant producers, and in our hypothetical, if the Ukrainians are in the tent, also access to the global experts on how to actually use these things on the battlefield. So just assume that we're buying lots and lots and lots of the things, without fixating on any particular design yet. That doesn't help us cross off any of our remaining countries though, so let's do that. Bulgaria has a significant defence sector, but a lot of it's dedicated to producing Soviet-style weapons. And so for the moment, given how cheap some of them are, that's what we're going to get them to keep producing. The idea is to build up what I'm calling a transfer reserve. Basically something Europe has to transfer to allies who still use Soviet weapons if they ever need military support, or if things get really bad, a reserve to equip some third or fourth line formations. Basically, if the geopolitical situation ever calls for it, we want to be able to press the AKs for everyone button, augmented by a solid selection of things like Bulgarian RPG rounds. Digging a little deeper here, Portugal is currently producing a new class of offshore patrol vessels, the first of which entered service in 2010, and given they're comparatively simple and designed to operate specifically in the North Atlantic, extending that production for low-risk duties like fisheries protection is the approach we're going with to deal the Portuguese in. That gets us to Albania and North Macedonia. Perhaps unsurprisingly, neither is really at the cutting edge of military equipment development, but footwear is among Albania's leading exports. So guess what? They're about to get into the army boots business in a big way, while Montenegro and North Macedonia are both going to get contracts to support our industrial production elsewhere. Between them, we're looking at potential supplies of things like electricity, ores and chemical products, and other elements we might want to integrate into our supply chains. And then finally, even though we tapped the checks for the rifle and the chassis for the Badana, they're also home to a company that makes inflatable military decoys. And so if they can take a break from making guns every now and again to crank out some militarized inflatables, that'd be much appreciated. And somehow, as you can see on this list here, we're done. All participating countries are now contracted, although some are obviously more contracted than others. We could go on window shopping more and more European military equipment for our hypothetical force, but even though this is an April 1st style episode, I do want to zoom out a bit and use our not particularly serious exercise to make some slightly more serious points. In a lot of cases, European firms are capable of designing and fielding equipment that's broadly comparable or even in some cases superior to their relevant US or other foreign comparators, provided you had the political will to standardise and the resources and time to scale production. In many areas, you'd expect a European-equipped force to look very modern and capable. But of course, as you'd expect after decades of reliance on the United States, there are some capability gaps where European answers have only started to emerge recently and might not yet be 100% equivalent to potential imports, or where the gap is still very binary. There's no current option for a fifth-generation fighter, no strategic bomber, and in the air and missile defence field, no exo-atmospheric interceptor akin to the American SM-3 or the Israeli Arrow. And of course, that's just to name a few. That's not to say those capability gaps couldn't eventually be filled, of course, but in the real world, unlike with this exercise, resources are always going to be finite. And to date, it's often just made more sense for countries to purchase the proven and existing capability from the US or other countries if they need it, rather than take on the cost and risk of developing a domestic or at least European solution. Unless or until some of those gaps are closed, some degree of continued reliance on the United States is probably to be expected. And planners usually have pretty good processes for trying to determine whether closing that sort of gap is worth the likely effort and risk. But it's worth emphasising again that while most of these gaps are very small or even negative, some are quite large, and not all of the relevant barriers are industrial. For example, I'd argue one of the most immediate gaps isn't anything to do with tanks or fighter jets. It's the gap on European versus American space-based assets. Europe does have its own GPS equivalent, Galileo, but there is a massive discrepancy in terms of launch capacity and cadence, military ISR and communication satellites, civilian communication, and satellite internet. Couple that with the fact that Europe's proven anti-satellite capabilities are, shall we say, embryonic compared to some of its competitors, and you arguably have a bit of a weak hand when it comes to competing for that literal high ground. That's not to say that some of the building blocks aren't there. The world's largest constellation of synthetic aperture radar satellites, for example, is operated by a Finnish firm, ICEYE. And because satellites themselves have been evolving and getting so much cheaper so quickly, it's possible to see a scenario where other powers, like China or Europe, are able to field capabilities that are similar to, but not as extensive as those of the US, for a fraction of what it cost the US to originally put those in place. Doing that, however, would involve a focused, expensive effort, which brings home one of the core points I'm trying to make about European or multilateral defence in general. Achieving the best results when you don't have countries large enough to achieve critical development and purchasing mass on their own often requires an immense degree of cooperation, trust, and a willingness to put big-picture alliance outcomes ahead of national ones. Even if, and it's a big if, it made raw defence economic sense, if we actually tried to convert the UK into a giant missile factory while giving the Royal Navy a French carrier, the French a German tank, and the Germans Dutch corvettes, British fighters, Czech rifles, Polish and French artillery firing Slovak ammo while under the protection of a Franco-Italian air defence system, your number one barrier probably wouldn't be technical, designing the equipment or coming up with an industrial strategy. It'd be the risk that half the politicians you need to sign off on the budget have a stroke 20% of the way through your pitch. And even more realistic intermediate steps, like moving towards a common European defence market, are the kind of extraordinary ideas that would probably take extraordinary pressure to make happen. Whether the geopolitical developments of 2025 or 2026 ultimately prove to be that kind of pressure, only time will tell. But in the meantime, for all of you who voted for this topic, I hope you enjoyed the exercise, and the admittedly strange amalgam of kit that our EDF became. And okay, channel update to close out. Firstly, big thanks to everyone who voted in the poll for this particular topic. I've always had somewhat mixed feelings about the whole April Fool's video concept, but hopefully you felt this one hits a kind of happy medium. While we're using a fairly out there hypothetical, like a fictional universe or a pan-European defence force, and then using it not just to have a little bit of fun, but also to illustrate some more serious concepts. That also touches on why I went with that semi-random method of selecting the equipment that we chose, because I didn't want this to become a best tank or best vehicle episode, especially since those discussions can be very involved and usually depend on the context and the potential operator that you're talking about. I more just wanted to be able to illustrate concepts, potential gaps, and maybe laugh a bit at some of the weird combinations we came up with. Next week we'll be back to some more serious topics, especially that given the recent pace of global events in Ukraine and otherwise, it is admittedly sometimes feeling harder and harder to keep up within the framework of one episode a week. Not that you should expect that schedule to change anywhere in the near future, of course. In any case, with my thanks to all of you as always for your ongoing engagement and support, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and then I'll see you all again next week.